This is a problem that concerns everybody as long as they are human.
You're wearing your earphones, right? Ask yourself, how was this made? And where is it going to go after I'm done using them?
When was the first time you realized you wanted to have a professional career around climate action and circular economy? I'm Naman Pandey, and in this episode, featured not expert is Jaspreet Kaur. Jaspreet is a climate change advisor at GIZ,
Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit,
which is an organization that works on behalf of the German government, the European Union, to conserve natural resources, minimize climate-related risks, and restructure agri-food systems to make them sustainable.
Where I work is the federal enterprise of the government of Germany, and we implement projects sanctioned under this larger framework. We work on natural resource management, energy, urban and industrial development. We work on plastics, textiles.
What are some misconceptions, especially around India when it comes to climate change?
Because you're planning for the city, it's also across a time horizon. We're a very heterogeneous country, so something that's working in Shimla is going to be very different from what's working in Kerala. One concept we studied at LSE was carbon lock-ins, basically infrastructure systems ingrained in the way we function. A circular economy nudges us to revisit those systems and also overhaul.
Before her second master's degree in environmental policy and regulation from LSE, Jaspreet got her bachelor's in physical planning from School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi. These are the things that I can do that will drive a tangible change towards the future of my country and the world as a whole.
India is uniquely positioned because we're still growing and we can still integrate climate action in our growth.
So this might be a dumb question, but what exactly happens to a landfill once it's filled? In keeping with the theme of learning from somebody that's just 2 steps ahead of us instead of an expert, my goal is to highlight this extremely rewarding but underrated career track that Jaspreet embarked upon and how you can do your bit to save the world. This is the Ready Set Do podcast, and to support it, please subscribe on YouTube and any other podcast apps. And now, without any further ado, here's Jaspreet. Welcome to the Ready Set Do podcast, where we learn from journeys of not experts who are just 2 steps ahead of us. Jaspreet, welcome.
Hi Naman. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to cover climate action and all of the amazing stuff that you've been doing in your career, which we'll be going into the details of that in just a little bit. But when was the first time you realized that you actually wanted to do work or have a professional career around, climate action and circular economies?
All right. Great. Thanks for the question, Naman. So I did my undergrad in urban planning. It's actually, the degree is called Bachelor in Physical Planning, but what we technically study is urban and regional planning, which is basically how communities, societies, cities, rural areas, peri-urban areas grow, how they develop, and what are the systems that go into sort of uh, supporting this development and seeing this kind of growth. And so this is what I was studying. This is what I studied during my undergrad. And so two things happened, Naman, parallelly. One is it's a very interesting program, and the first 2 years you're in class, but then the third year and fourth year you're for a very significant period of your time you are kind of on the road, because in every semester we pick up a different place, a different geography. We go to that place, we study that place, and by that I mean we actually as students go do physical surveys, understanding what really. So you look at all sectors that contribute to the physical and economic development of that space. So you're looking at housing, you're looking at transportation, you're looking at its local economy, if there are any industries, or if you are in a regional, if you're looking at it from a regional perspective, you're looking at agriculture. So basically all the dimensions that go into putting together this development. So it was a very interesting, exciting phase. I'm very fortunate because as a result of what I was studying, I had the opportunity to travel across the country. We were in Gujarat, we were in Odisha, we were in Kerala, we were in Himachal, and so you're traveling and you're studying, and you're looking at different aspects of growth and development, and it sort of built my understanding on what are the kind of factors that go into sort of putting together this growth story that we're all working towards,
Yeah.
right?
Uh-huh.
So that was one thing that happened. And in 2012, we had this opportunity to work on this project where we were putting together the strategy for UNICEF for on climate impacts across 6 states, and I think that was the key factor for me. That was kind of the turning point for me because uh, I had traveled a lot. I had spoken to all these people, but then I'm also doing this study, supporting this professor. And I think I've been very fortunate also in terms of having the right mentors at the right time. So this professor also kind of helped build my understanding on, how climate change is going to become a very significant sort of challenge. And it's some
Forward. Yeah.
opportunity as well. Exactly. So that was when I decided. So this was third year, and then in the fourth year, when in my final semester, we have to do a thesis.
Okay.
I chose. So my thesis topic was to do with if we were to integrate climate action in the way our cities are being planned, in the way our growth is being planned, what would that look like? And I looked at our statutory framework, which is the master plan of the city, and sort of did an analysis of, okay, what are the climate factors and what is it that the master plan talks about? And if we were to integrate the two, how would we ensure that we make our cities resilient, climate resilient, but also support in mitigating climate emissions. So that was kind of the starting
Wow.
point.
So that's already so interesting. I literally have 36,000 different questions already from what you've laid out. But I'm going to use this one at least as a jumping off point. What you said about how the course was built around the landscape. I think you mentioned the term. It was the physical landscape is what you were looking at. So can you maybe just for our listeners to help us rationalize, just kind of give us an example of when you say that, are you just looking at infrastructure within the city, like how certain neighborhoods are, maybe like what's the population density like, and what we can do to make sure that like the infrastructure supports all that, or was it more towards other side of things? Like if you just give us an example, I think that will be really helpful for us to understand what it is that this was doing because it sounds really, really fascinating.
Sure, sure. Um, so yes, to answer your question, it does both. It looks at core infrastructure requirements. So, as per the sort of the regulatory mechanism that drives all of this, you have a certain number of amenities you have to provide to a certain uh, population. So for every 10,000 people, you have to have so many hospitals, so many schools, other infrastructure, community centers, commercial spaces, green spaces. So we're definitely, so that's our core focus, but it's not, so we're looking at it because you're planning for the city. It's also across a time horizon. So we're doing a lot of population extrapolation in the next 10 years when the population grows. What is going to be the requirement in the next 20 years? So you've got as a cohort in that particular program, each one of us is looking at different sectors. So, at some point I'm looking at population or I'm looking at green space, these are looking at infrastructure. And within infrastructure, you've got water, sewerage, all of that. uh, One very interesting thing that has shaped, and this I would like to share, Naman, that has shaped my sort of thought process is, every time you start this planning process, the first thing you have to do is, and this is what we also do, I think you also do this at work now, understanding the problem and sort of curating and simplifying the problem, right? And then it's based on that defining, okay, what is it that we're working towards? I've been very fortunate now. This is what I think now. Back then, I used to find it kind of annoying because there used to be one student in the class who had the responsibility of putting together a methodology chart for the entire class. And
Interesting.
of
So
course,
it's
it
kind
was
of
very
consolidate all of the data that you had collected across all of this into one tangible format, right? Or
more than data. Yeah, more than data, sort of put together the approach.
okay,
So look
interesting.
at the why, look at the what, and look at the how. And of course, this was a collaborative process. I wasn't doing this myself. It was my peers, but it was sort of I was kind of leading that whole thing. So you look at what are the challenges that places are facing right now. There are water related challenges. There are power. All sorts of. What is the kind of vision that we're seeing for that place? What is it? And this is not just very physical or material materialistic in the sense not just focusing on infrastructure, but also looking at socio-cultural parameters. And India is a beautiful country. We're a very heterogeneous country. So every space has its own, something that's working in Shimla is going to be very different from what's working in Kerala. So I was preparing this methodology many a times, and just the process of thinking, okay, what's happening now, what's going to happen later, and how do you put this all together in not more than 50 words and define the objective.
Incredible.
Yeah,
And this, honestly, I just, feel kind of, maybe I'm outing myself here, but this is legitimately the first time I'm even hearing of a course like this. And honestly, if I could go back, turn the dial back and do something else with my life, this would be up there in terms of things that I would be very interested in. Just because think of and I'm sure you've obviously thought of it, so it's a rhetorical question, but just think of the impact that you're making here. You're literally designing a city. Like there's very few things that I feel are more critical to, as you said, any country's growth story than this. Real quick, one last question on this was, um, were you working mostly with um, like existing cities and kind of trying to look at how to make them better, or were you looking at net new cities from scratch that didn't even exist, or was it a mixture of?
it was a mixture of both, Naman. Most of the places we went to, we were looking at existing structures, but then we were also looking at we didn't really like I did not when I was doing the program, we didn't work on any greenfield projects, which is basically something from the scratch, but then
Okay.
we did have certain components where there was an element of it.
Mhm.
For example, if you're looking at a regional level planning exercise, so you already have your city, but that city is going to grow, right? And you're looking at it from a regional perspective, and you have these smaller towns around it. So you're not just focusing on what's happening right now within the physical boundary of that space, but you also you have a big picture perspective of, okay, when this grows, this is what is going to happen, and uh, this is how it's going to get interconnected in many ways with the towns around it. So in that regard, yes.
Makes sense. And I understand if you're not able to speak to this, which is not like you can just tell me if that's the case. But I am curious, what were some of the, I guess, just if you pick just any person, you can just take me for example. What were one or two findings from this entire experience of just urban planning in general that you think would surprise the average Indian person to know about their cities? So you mentioned earlier that there's a requirement for a certain amount of green spaces that should have, like when you were sharing all of that, I thought that was really cool. I didn't actually realize there were stipulations around that. But if anything comes to mind around other things that might surprise us when it comes to Indian cities, I am actually very curious to hear your take.
Surprise us when it comes to Indian cities.
Most from the planning perspective, but yeah.
Um, I don't know if, well, I don't think surprise might be the right word, but I think something that we should as citizens, and I'm speaking from a very personal point of view, is that, we have, as I said, we have city level master plans, right?
Mhm.
Um, I don't know how many citizens really sort of engage with their city from
I
that
didn't
perspective.
even know that existed until 10 minutes ago.
Right. And so I would just, it's very cool. Like, when I saw Delhi's master plan, you just correlate things on so many other levels because, you're living in that space. But then when you actually see the space from a whole different perspective as a city and the infrastructure and everything it has to offer, and a master plan looks at everything. It also looks at elements such as heritage, right? So you look at all your landmarks and your monuments and all of that. So I think it will be a very interesting process for everyone to just go have a look at what the master plan is. And interestingly, master plans are also then subdivided, like your city is subdivided into zones and local areas. So that just sort of helps you give an understanding of what is it uh, what is it about that space you're living in? So I think that could be an interesting, well, on.
That's right. I think that's I mean I'm surprised by that. So I'm sure that is news for most of our listeners. Like I definitely didn't even know that. So my understanding was back in the day, some British dude or dudette must have been like, okay, this is how we're going to do it, and then they did it, and then called it a day, and then we're just stuck with that. So it's just good to know that that's not the case, I guess. So moving forward here, I know you then went for your master's degree in at LSE. So can you talk through your experience over there? What was maybe some of one or two more notable maybe achievements or things that you learned that really blew you away in your journey towards what you do currently, which is what we will get to once this particular section is done.
So what happened was that I did my first master's in environmental planning, and that's when I got more engaged with climate action. And there are a lot of global and national level policies, frameworks that sort of orient action towards climate change. And I realized that so one thing that was very clear by then, Naman, was that I was interested in sort of contributing to this effort towards addressing climate change, I think. And I also had this understanding that, okay, India is also uniquely positioned because we're still growing and we can still integrate climate action in our growth. We can align our development along climate action, and it would be interesting to see the larger policy framework and governance mechanisms that can support and contribute to this. And so it was a combination of policy, development, climate action, and LSE is an unparalleled sort of place to be in, right?
Yeah.
To study that. So that's how that happened. And I would like to, if we have the time, I would like to talk about my experience in LSE as well.
Yeah, I would love to. Yeah, so I would love to hear that. And in addition to that, just from what you just laid out, I am also curious if you could share. I'm really curious about what you said about policy making, essentially, because it again, it's just one of those things that you just feel like, yeah, I'm sure it's somebody's job, but this is personally my first opportunity of talking to somebody that studied it, more than glancing through a few Wikipedia articles, which is the extent of my expertise on the subject. So when you say studying policy, does that entail mostly looking at case studies of what worked in the past versus what didn't work? Or is it kind of more hands on where you have to solve problems that are maybe like practice problems and such? What does that look like? Like, can you take us through the journey of learning about policy from an institution like, LS?
Sure. So it's a mix of everything that you said, Naman. Uh, I would categorize it into sort of four key buckets. There's a lot more to it, but four major buckets. So um, you're looking at there are certain what do I say? Certain components to policy making, right?
Mhm.
You're looking at regulatory frameworks that exist. First of all, you're looking at the core sector. So it
Correct.
could be, we're talking about climate, but it could also be health, it could be education. So you're looking at the core sector and you're trying to understand what is it that the existing policy is doing, but there are still challenges that we're facing. So core problem identification and just sort of planning for the future that, okay, in the next 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, this is what we foresee. So one is understanding the given structures around it. The second thing that we did as students was you have a lot of policy theories and you have a lot of frameworks that help you understand how policies work. And dare I say, the beauty of it all is that you you're studying, but you're also parallelly developing this understanding of why the world works the way it works.
Exactly.
Because you're looking at all these very exciting frameworks. So, for example, I'll tell you, one of my favorite frameworks that we study is the multi level perspective theory, MLP. Of course, it also faces a lot of criticism for multiple reasons. But what this framework essentially talks about is that change happens across three levels. Okay. So you've got a niche, you've got a regime, and then you've got your landscape. So your niche is where core innovation happens. So for example, just, let's take EVs, electric vehicles, right? So there was this technological innovation that happened at a very micro level.
Correct.
But then you also have a regime. Your regime is your meso level sort of structure. So your markets, your institutions, your
Right.
innovation also has to resonate or sort of not contribute.
Scale up as well, right? Probably.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's going to only work when it's connected to that. So that's at the regime level. And then you have a landscape level sort of framework, which is basically your politics, your global geopolitics, or things like public interest. So these are larger frameworks that sort of define, well, I won't say define, but sort of, indirectly govern societies, your value systems. And so, for example, now a lot of young people are interested in climate action. So, at your landscape level, you have this growing public concern about climate change. So, that's going to define a lot of things that will happen at the regime and at the niche level,
Mm.
and vice versa.
I see.
So,
So it works both ways. It's not just bottom up always. Yeah.
yes, yes. For it to work, it has to sort of be bottom up. But so anyway, so we were studying a lot of these frameworks. Then there are multiple frameworks like these. There's one on agenda setting. How do things actually come into the policy picture? So a lot of things that have happened in India in the past 5 years, right? They've
Mm.
become an important sort of priority for the government of India. And this whole process of how this happens, why this happens, there are multiple factors, social, economic factors that contribute to it. So just studying these processes, and then so you've got these frameworks, and how they helped me was, of course, I was studying these from a policy perspective, but they also helped build my own mental model and
Mm.
thinking systems in my sort of way of processing and understanding the world. So that was a very interesting process.
That
Uh,
sounds
but there's
so cool. Yeah.
yeah. But then you also have, I think, the beauty of the very exciting part about it all is that you can take up any course, you can take up any credit, what we call subject in India, as long as you're able to justify how it contributes to your larger program. So I took up this course on called mixed methods research, which was quantitative and qualitative research. You're studying core data assessment, statistics, just so applying tools like RCTs, randomized control trials, on just studying the effects before and after. So that was a very sort of technical part of what I was doing. But that, again, very exciting because the cohort is a mixed cohort. So you're not just looking at all these tools from a climate perspective, but I had in my cohort, I had peers from the health program, I had peers from the economic studies program. So you get a multifaceted understanding of these tools, and then you also have the option of studying finance, of studying governance. So it's very flexible. So you're to go, going back to what I said earlier, these buckets.
Yeah.
So your and you have your policies, you have these frameworks, you're looking at very tangible tools on how do you apply these tools to policy making.
Yeah. I mean, just the fact for me that you're able to study governance, policy, all of these things that have just, really infatuated me to no end. But, I never just was able to formally try and learn this. Like, again, watching 200 YouTube videos in a year is not formal education. Let's accept it. As much as, you still learn stuff, but I feel like when you're in that environment, to your point, what you were saying about the place itself, like, yeah, just completely different magical things happen. Slight detour here, but I am curious to kind of hear about um really just kind of your selection process into LC. I guess, can you quickly walk us through maybe what's like a standard profile that kind of you need as a kind of a bare minimum in order to even be considered? Because I know it's really competitive, but I've actually never been able to quantify just how competitive it is. So if you could do that.
So one good thing is that, well, good thing in the sense to start with, unlike an MBA that you're trying to do outside India, most of the good universities and colleges ask for a minimum 5 years of work experience. So no, so this is not the case in what I'm saying is this is not the case in this particular policy program that I was in. Uh, I mean, your regular TOEFL, and if you're doing a economic policy program, I think you also have to give GRE. But so leaving all that aside, it's it all comes down to your SOP and your resume. These are the two deciding factors. And my suggestion would be work for at least 4 years in the field before going to do your master's there. It's a whole different experience. I mean, I was very fortunate because I had exposure, I had hands-on experience of the ground because of the program I was in before this at the School of Planning and Architecture, studying urban planning, right? So it was 4 years of, and that also, every time we had discussions in class at LSE, right, I could visualize things because I have been on the ground. So it's still going to be very interesting. I had a lot of my classmates had just completed their bachelor's in the States or elsewhere and had come to do a master's immediately. So of course, it's a different learning experience for them as well. But it yeah, in terms of value addition, it's a whole different experience if you work on the field, and I mean on the ground, and you then come for a master's. That's very exciting. And yeah, the key things that they look at are your writing and your communication skills because you're uh, you're going to be working on policy, at least for the program that I was in. So yeah, you have to meet certain requirements in terms of your writing skills.
Yeah, and obviously even just the ability, like obviously just make having ideas isn't enough, or it means nothing if you cannot share them in a manner that
Right.
other people can understand. So obviously, yeah, that makes sense. That almost is like an implied, I feel like, at any of these elite institutions, especially.
Yeah.
So cool. So from there, where did your journey take you next? So you've just graduated from LSE, one of literally the most elite institutions in the world. What do you do next?
What do you do next? What I wanted to do next was a PhD. I actually applied for the 1+3 program, which is 1 year of MSc plus 3 years of PhD. But then during my final sort of term, so they don't have a semester. I mean, well, they kind of do, but they call it term. I did my thesis was based on a topic in Delhi, and I came down and I had when I went, I had thought I'd go do a PhD, but then when I came back, I had certain ideas, I had certain topics in mind that I was working on for a PhD. I was speaking to a few professors, but then I just felt, when I was back, I just felt this need to maybe work for a bit. I mean, I was working on certain topics. I also submitted certain projects outside LSE for a PhD, but it didn't feel like this was it because when you're doing a PhD, you kind of become like an expert in that particular domain. And although those topics were interesting, it didn't give me that kick that, okay, yes, this is what I want to be sort of
Right.
focusing on for the next 4 years of my life. So I just thought, okay, maybe I should, wait it out. And as I said earlier, that it's always great to work in the field and then go back to study. So I just thought, okay, maybe let's work in the field for a bit.
Yes.
So to be very honest, Naman, it was not very easy, that transition, because you're kind of in between a lot of things. You're looking at PhDs, but you're also looking at jobs, and you're trying to figure out a lot of aspects around that. But then one good thing happened was there was this SDSN, so the Sustainable Development Solutions Network Fellowship, which is the SDSN framework is kind of under the UN.
Wow.
So this fellowship is called the Local Pathways Fellow. And I found that very interesting because they were working on SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, the implementation of SDGs, climate action. And this was all from a very, youth perspective, working on local problems and, working on tangible issues that would, and addressing those that would contribute to achieving the SDGs. So it was a fellowship program.
And how does one apply to one of these? Just for the record.
Sure. So they have applications open every year. I think around November. I'm not sure. Oh, I can clarify.
Oh,
Uh,
I'm just generally curious about what's the selection procedure. Like you just apply online kind of and write your essay on why you should be shortlisted with a resume and such kind of.
exactly, and it's a global program. And I think
Right.
back we selected 12 fellows. So yeah, I chose. I was like, okay, we're still in between a lot of things, and we're still trying to figure out a few things. So this fellowship seemed like a great option. It was online, but it was very intensive. We had it's a global fellowship, and you have online classes. Well, not classes, but discussion forums, and then you're um, I think it was every three. So it was a 9-month fellowship, and every 3 months you're given a topic, sort of a project to work on. And the very exciting part is that you have fellows from all across the globe. So you're sort of speaking to them about their local problems, but then how it contributes to the sort of global area of change making.
Really
So yeah, and that was actually my sort of first-ish kind of the starting point of getting into circular economy and waste, because the topic we got was it was related to waste management and to the SDG about that. And my peers in my group were also working on waste in sub-Saharan Africa. So yeah, that's how it was the key entry point. And we put together a solution framework for informal waste workers, and that actually featured in the SDSN came up with this report on how do you address challenges across the whole Sustainable Development Goals framework. And our solution featured there, so that was very exciting for all of us.
So almost like a finalist in the world world series of fellows that were shortlisted. That, I mean, that sounds like a huge deal actually. Wow. Good job. Good for you on making that. From there I'm actually kind of I want to divert our attention a little bit to this topic of circular economies. Uh, while kind of preparing for talking to you, I did kind of read up on it a little bit, and it makes intuitive sense for me. But it would be great if you could kind of dumb it down for us, and maybe just share in a brief just like a, yeah, a brief walkthrough of what exactly circular economies are and what they seek to achieve predominantly. I know it's like a lot of trickle down effects, but if you could at least share the major ones, that would be a great jumping off.
Okay, if I had to put it very simply, Naman, you're wearing your earphones right now, right?
Hmm?
So you just look at them and you ask yourself, how is this made? And where is it going to go after I'm done using them? It starts with these two simple but very complicated questions, right? So the whole idea of circular economy is that we start re-envisioning how we look at products and materials uh, across the value chain. So, and by that I mean right from design, not even materials, forget materials, that's step 2 or 3, but right from design to how we're going to dispose them or reuse, upcycle, recycle, any of that. That's a whole different conversation. So that, to put it very simply, that's what circular economy is about. Um, and it's sort of it's a very interesting, I feel, opportunity for us to look at innovation, because it
Right.
it's very strongly tied together to climate action. Material extraction, material usage contributes to uh, about 50% of global emissions. And if we were to start looking at the solutions we're currently working on from a circular economy perspective, from a material science, from a design, from a disposal perspective, I'm pretty sure that's, I mean,
Mhm.
just think of it on those lines. It's a very moving idea. And
For
uh,
sure, 100%. Um, I guess from there, where my mind is going is, I think the connection between circular economies and how they pertain to reduction of waste, or at least smarter management of waste, that part's clear to me. The thing I'm still a little bit nebulous about in my head is, it does make intuitive sense that better waste management equals like just basically good earth or better climate. But can you help me kind of really put my finger on exactly how waste and climate action are related? Maybe if you could give like a tangible example, I think that would go a long way in kind of reinforcing that understanding.
sure, absolutely. So, see, there are two sides to it. Okay, one is, when you're talking about waste, you're talking about a certain product, you're talking about a certain material, right? Now, the extraction of that material has emissions associated with it. And when that product is dumped in the landfill, so you've sort of, it's the extraction process has had a certain amount of emissions, but
I see.
that so that's one side of it. The second is when anything is disposed. So let's take food for example, right?
Mhm.
And when we're looking at core emissions, so you're looking at your greenhouse gases, and each gas has a global warming potential. So
Correct.
uh, when things are disposed and when things are sort of quote unquote rotting, might not be the best term, but they're emitting gases, and each of those gas has a certain global warming potential. So uh so that's kind of how waste contributes to
Yeah. Makes
change in terms of emissions.
huh. And so actually this might also be a dumb question, but what exactly happens to a landfill once it's filled? Like, sorry, this is really something I should know. I feel like most people should know. I understand the concept of landfills where you just bring in the whole city or whatever area's dump and just like leave it there. But what happens to it actually? I've never thought about this until just now. Oh,
It's just there, stuff's just lying there, and unfortunately, because it's all mixed waste, yeah, it's all mixed waste, right? So it's creating leachate, which is basically your gooey fluid that has a very strong smell, and that's going to seep down into your groundwater. It's going to get into your soil, and obviously you have your emissions in the air. So yeah, your landfills are they're just it's just there. It's just a big dump of waste just lying there. And of course, I mean, uh, you have rodents and birds and all of these sort of creatures gnawing on it here and there. But then if you're going to, the biggest problem is that it's just going to sort of be there. And there are materials that don't decompose. So
correct. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And just from a very theoretical point of view, um, and I'm only really asking this because you've probably studied this, but just really in general around the world, is landfilling still the kind of go-to default method of waste management, or is that not?
there's a difference in what should ideally be happening to the waste and what's happening. So unfortunately, yes, we're still at a stage where
Hmm.
a lot of cities are proactively addressing this.
Okay.
Um, where there is this realization that we have to reduce our landfills both in terms of volume and area.
Mm.
But we're still at the stage where we're building systems to sort of avoid this. But
Like,
to answer your question, there has been substantive action on this front where there is this idea of segregating materials and seeing how each material can be processed further so as to avoid the amount of waste that goes into landfill. But Naman, I want to come in here and see that's exactly what happens. When we talk about circular economy, most of the conversation ends up going focusing on downstream solutions. Waste management is a downstream solution,
that,
which is
that
very important.
that's such a great call out. Yeah. I see where you're going with this. Yeah.
You know what I mean? But we also have to focus on upstream
Correct.
solutions and conversations
Just
and all
have
that.
there be no waste in the first place, right? And you won't even have
Exactly.
the problem to begin with. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
And what really puzzles and excites me at times is that, to think of it, seems like a very, I don't want to oversimplify this, but if we were just to ask ourselves, do I really need this thing? Like, what value does this product or this thing add to my life?
Right.
Just sort of, and that's one of the key sort of R's of circular economy, refuse. The first thing is to ask yourself, can I do away with this thing?
Correct.
But yeah, and it's philosophically also a very complicated situation because the way society and human civilization has evolved with sort of, there is this aspirational component to it. How do you deal with that? There is emotion associated with things, but then you also have this whole idea that, okay, we have limited resources. We have a certain sort of, you should look at donut economics. You have a certain sphere of things within which we can do things
Hmm.
in terms of material extraction, in terms of waste disposal. So
Yeah.
how do I look at that? And the key is trying to achieve a balance, which is very tricky. But the good thing is there's a lot of action happening, and I'm very
Exactly. And yeah, that's what I would love to shine a flashlight on next. I did before I do that, I did really like what you said about how it's truly a philosophical, at times almost religious. Like there's just so many aspects linked to this. As somebody that has liked the movie slash book Fight Club, the first thing that came to mind was when Tyler Durden says, "The things you own end up owning you." And it just rings especially true in times like these, where you see all of these fast fashion brands and all come up. Stuff that like you're advertising something that can only be worn 10 times and you will have to throw it away after that. But at what cost, right? Where does it go? And you also did quash such a great or such a common misconception around this, right? That what you said about we're always attacking the downstream. Why must it be like that? Let's not do that. So, on that similar vein, what are some other misconceptions, especially around India when it comes to climate change and the type of topic?
okay. Um, Great, because I was going to make a point that sort of correlates to this
Mhm.
question. See, when I say that we have to question, things in terms of does this really add value?
Mhm.
I also want to reassure you that we also have to be realistic because we, as a community, we're also growing. Uh, and I understand how I mean, well, I work in this field, so it's a very pressing need, but I think it's also very important to be realistic and accept the fact that we will continue to grow. But opportunity we have here is to right. So the opportunity here is to define and align this growth uh, in a way that it aligns with our climate goals. So to come to the question that you just posed, I would say so misconception might probably not be the right word because in India now there is this unsaid growing acceptance of okay, there is something changing in terms of your weather patterns and in terms of
Yeah.
availability of resources across the country.
With 50 degrees Celsius heat, right, during the summers, which is just
Right,
not normal.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So people might not be talking about it in a very technical sense, but there is this sort of uh, unsaid accept. Well, I wouldn't say acceptance, but just this understanding that okay, something is happening.
Mm.
Um, Let me just share an anecdote with you. This was
Yeah.
so I've also volunteered with Child Rights and You, which is an NGO that works on child rights, and this was after my first masters. I was just trying to understand the social dynamics of development and what are the challenges that sort of certain communities face. And we were working in this underprivileged community in Delhi.
Of-
Um, and we started, so we used to, I was teaching children there.
Okay.
And I started this English reading club where we would just pick up books and, read and, or just say stories just to sort of make them communicate.
Mhm.
And what we were also doing was we were also supporting uh, the admission of these children in the local schools. A lot of them were not going to school or were in and out of school. So, as volunteers, as community workers, we were also supporting that. So, I used to try inciting this conversation on climate change with these children.
Wow.
And they would obviously, it was a very different understanding for them. And there was this one child I remember. She was not in school, and I was trying to talk to her that we need to get your admission done, and I will need so and so ID, and I'm going to need these documents. Can you arrange them? Ask your mother. And then we were also having conversations on climate change the same day. We were talking about floods, and she said, "Oh, there was a flood back in my village," and she had some memories about it, and she spoke about it, and so this was a conversation about climate change from an impact perspective.
Right.
And then when I had the conversation with her on her admission, and her mother told me that they had lost certain ID proofs, which were, well, we had to put together a few documents.
Wow.
And then I told her that, we're going to need that ID proof connected to another ID proof that we already had. And there was a very tight deadline in terms of getting her admission done. And if we were not meeting that, she would miss out on a year of, school.
Right.
She would have to join a grade later, but her age would have already. So anyway, so the point I'm trying to make is that so this was climate impact in terms of, you know, she was losing out on 1 year of education there. So I would say there's a misconception. It's just that you have to communicate about climate action in a certain way with different communities. And I feel now there's also this need of not just talking about the problem, but we also need to talk about it from a CTA perspective, call to action. Right? What is it that you can do? What is it that and again, we're a very diverse country, socially, economically, culturally. So you obviously cannot have the same conversation uh with everyone. You have to, the narrative has to be different. It has to be articulated in a way that that particular community is receptive. But the call to action, the solutions are affordable, accessible to that particular community as well. So it's a very nuanced approach that is needed. And it has to be a collaborative effort, right?
100%.
You cannot blame somebody for doing certain things.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I especially like what you said about that call to action piece because I think it actually dovetails exactly with what really I'm trying to do here on obviously with this podcast on a more philosophical level. I feel like this is where it begins, where if a person had nothing to do with any of this, had no understanding, but then after listening to this conversation, then they're like, okay, now I know as an educated, young, whatever, 20 to 25-year-old person living in India, these are the following type of things that I can do without it being too intrusive on my day-to-day life that
Right.
will drive a tangible change towards the future of myself, my community, my country, and the world as a whole. So when you say call to action, and I know we cannot boil this ocean, so maybe do you have any specific CTAs for any young people that might be listening to this, maybe 20 to 25-year-olds? We'll just stick with the educated people for now. Obviously, like you can argue that maybe that's not the best person or type of group to optimize for, but that's just the first thing that came to mind.
Uh, okay, so one thing with climate change is, and for young people is, so there are two things. Okay, there is, I mean, to your question as well, what you can do at a personal level. I think most of us kind of the cohort that you're talking about, educated, right? We more or less have an idea in terms of just look at your consumption, like what transportation modes do you use, the food you eat, everything that it's a very lifestyle oriented sort of
Exactly. That's what I'm
approach
just.
that you have to have, right?
It just leaps into everything pretty much. Food choices, everything, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And in fact, there are, it would be great for the young to sort of engage with. So, for example, Government of India has this very interesting, very simple mission called Mission Life, which talks about what is it that you can do at an individual level. So, it talks about energy, water, food, just consumption on multiple fronts. So you get that. It's very simple. It's very, I won't, I mean, well, it's very subjective, sort of easy to do.
Yeah.
But so engage with, these sort of formal conversations that are happening. But if you're going to look at it from a career point of view in terms of CTA, what is it that I can do, right, to engage on climate action? See, one thing is that you have to juxtapose climate action with your existing strengths, because it's one field that requires a lot of, um, um, you have to be motivated. You have to sort of keep going at things, because it's not easy. It's
There's a lot of hurdles here. Yeah. Probably way more hurdles than probably any other career path out there. Yeah.
Exactly. One concept very quickly that we studied at LSE was lock-ins, carbon lock-ins. So a lock-in is basically, we already have infrastructure systems, rather, not just physical, but also social, habitual systems that are ingrained in the way we function.
Uh-huh.
And what climate action, what circular economy kind of nudges us to do is question and sort of, I won't say overhaul, but just revisit those systems and, well, in a way, also overhaul them to create new systems. So,
And I know for this last section, I know there's obviously a limited information that you can share on this, but can you maybe shed some light on the work that you've been doing at GIZ, which is where you're currently employed, and kind of just a day in the life, really, in terms of the type of work that goes on and what you get to contribute and get your hands dirty with on a daily basis?
Oh, sure, Naman. So just to give you and the audience an idea of what GIZ is and what is it what's the framework under which we work. So I basically work on climate action, but the medium through which I'm working is International Development Cooperation. I'm gonna call it DevCop because it's just too long. Say again and again. So I work in DevCop. And international DevCop happens through multiple modes. So you have bilateral cooperation, you have multilateral cooperation. So your UN is what falls under multilateral because it's more. And bilateral cooperation is between two countries. So this is where GIZ and Germany comes in. India and Germany, they have a bilateral cooperation agreement. So it's basically two countries coming together to work towards common goals. Here, the common goals are the SDGs, climate action, and sort of just, supporting growth that's more sustainable development goals, as I said earlier. So this is the broader framework, this cooperation agreement. Every 2 years, the heads of the state meet and they sign partnership agreements. They sign joint declarations of intent, which sort of it well, I won't say it kind of defines the sectors along which the two countries will work.
Interesting.
There's circular economy, energy, green hydrogen, all of this. So this is like the larger framework. And GIZ, which is where I work, it's a federal enterprise under the government. Well, it's a federal enterprise for the government of Germany. And what we do is we implement the projects that are sort of designed and sanctioned under this larger framework. Right? And GIZ works across multiple fronts of climate action. So we work on natural resource management, we work on energy, we work on urban and industrial development. We also work on skills and economic growth. So I work in the circular economy and climate change team, working on a lot of circular economy. We work on plastics, we work on textiles. I personally don't, but the circular economy team does, on electronic waste. And so this is, the larger framework. In terms of my core work, I think it's, I've been very fortunate, Naman, because I've sort of been in a position where I understand the multiple levels at which change is happening, but also have a very spectrum-wide understanding of things on climate action. So, and what I mean by this is I get to work with the union ministries in India. I get to work with state governments, but I also get to work with research institutions, think tanks that are sort of doing the core research on climate science. And again, since about, and the very interesting part about this is I'm also getting to work with a lot of startups now, because these are sort of the key innovation drivers. So, working on what's the latest technology, what's coming up in terms of material science. And you have some very interesting startups and companies that are working on very interesting climate action solutions. So our role here is so GIZ pilots solutions on the ground. And we pilot the solution, but we also do capacity building to ensure that that solution sustains and scales. We also do policy advocacy with the government of India. We sort of, there are larger policy frameworks. We do research with, but we also work on piloting innovation, and which is where we've been working with, not directly, but through programs. We also work with certain programs. We've also been engaging with startups. I won't say directly working with them, but engaging with them.
Right.
So it's a very systems-driven work that I have, where I'm working on multiple levels. And in terms of personal, at a very personal level, my learning has been immense, because I've had the opportunity to interact with senior bureaucrats, officers, and also CEOs of companies who've, some of the big global climate action organizations, but also at the very micro level. I've also been a part of a project that is working on a waste management solution at a neighborhood level in in northern India. So it's a very across the, as I said, across multiple levels. So you're on the ground as well. You're implementing, executing projects, but you also have an understanding of larger policy frameworks. You're also looking at innovation. You're looking at the state machinery, and I mean, governance machinery is immense. It's intricate and uh, also beautiful in a certain way.
I
Because
can
so
only imagine. Yeah, exactly. I just feel like that is something that I would just enjoy so much. And I can see how you're so happy when you share this, and your passion for this really shines through. Wow. Before we wrap up here, is there, I want to give you the chance to share anything that you want with just really all of our listeners. It can be about climate change, but it doesn't have to be. But I just wanted to give you that chance if you have something top of mind.
um yeah, I just something that you asked me, what can the youth do, or what can someone who's trying to work in this sphere do. um I would say that just in your own way, try engaging with climate change in whatever way possible. And by this, I don't mean that you have to go study or you have to do a master's or anything, but just question it from your perspective. Just understand what is it that you could do. And now there are a lot of youth groups that sort of support this sort of engagement in a very constructive manner. And there's only so much that public institutions can do for us. At the end of the day, there's also a certain degree of onus that we have as citizens. So I would say engage with climate action on as a citizen, as a professional, and
Right.
just see what is it that you can do. Yeah.
I feel like that's, yeah, if you're going to take away one thing from this, I feel like that is, yeah, such a fitting thing to take away. So really appreciate you sharing that. And even more importantly, really want to thank you for taking the time today, not only for kind of talking to us and through me, educating hopefully many out there about exactly what this entire, spiel is about, with the whole doomsdaying around conspiracy theories around just climate change and how it's going to end it, destroy the world and all that. And it just really helps, I feel like, when you talk to somebody as educated, as learned in this field, to come to us and talk to us about, hey, this is why this is important. This is the work that I'm doing. Yeah, yeah, truly, truly blessed to be, given the chance to talk to people such as yourself and, share the wealth of knowledge that you bring to the table. So I really appreciate you taking.
Of course. Thank you. Thanks, Naman. And this is something that I told you when we were talking over the phone, that, a lot of the climate conversation ends up happening within climate bubbles.
Right.
And this is what we need. We need people like you. We need creators like you to mainstream this conversation and to make it more, as you've said, not from a doomsday perspective that we're all going to die. I mean, we are facing challenges, but let's approach this more pragmatically, more realistically, and from a solutions point of view, and not from a, blaming and just sort of.
Yeah.
So thanks to you, creators like you who are supporting this in your own way. Kudos to you as well, Namat. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of that episode with Jaspreet. Hopefully, you all took away as much as I did from that incredible conversation around how easy, simple steps can go such a long way in terms of saving the world and making it a more sustainable place. If you would like to support me, the easiest way to do that is by subscribing to me on YouTube and leaving me up to a 5-star rating on Spotify or any of your favorite podcast apps. Another way that goes really far is by commenting below any feedback or guest suggestions that you have. Catch you all in the next one. New episodes every Wednesday.